Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third webinar in the Cityforum Smart Power Intelligent Defence series, which is being conducted for the third year in succession with advice from the Ministry of Defence, the support of BAE Systems, and with the help of Professor Michael Mainelli, Sheriff of the City of London and Chairman of ZN, who is chairing this particular discussion. We have four excellent panelists. Anthony Cordesman from CSIS, who we're delighted to welcome back. He's participated earlier in this program. Madeleine Moon, who's been involved in all three of these forums. We're delighted to have her again. And Carl Miller, who's participated as well, who is an expert on information, disinformation, fake news, and all the rest of it, which is featured quite big time on this agenda. And we welcome Catarina Thompson from Exeter University, who works with Cityforum, lockdowns permitting, on the question of public opinion and defence and security. And she has experience and does research on both sides of the Atlantic. And we thought it would be interesting to bring her view into this discussion as well. Michael manages to combine a huge amount of material and a load of questions into an hour. And he's here with his stopwatch. Thank you, Michael, for guiding us. We look forward to this discussion.
Well, that's fantastic. And I'm delighted to be here. And thank you very much, Mark, for that warm welcome. I'm also delighted to get the stopwatch out on myself. So just a quick reminder of the program today. We're going to have a round robin from our four speakers. I won't be introducing them. It's not because I'm rude, but it's because you can read their biographies on the webpage on which you registered. And that's probably the most efficient way to do it. Anthony Cordesman is going to talk about U.S. values and policies under Biden, Madeleine Moon about global Britain in this disordered world, Carl Miller on information and trust, and Catarina Thompson on what influences public opinion. We'll then break into two sessions we'd like to cover, which we covered in our pre-session, which was we'd like to discuss the concepts behind splinterisation, and then we'd like to move on to what are relationships really going to be like in a complicated triangle of the US, China, and Europe, with, of course, Britain's role being there as a very important element of that. And then to you, the audience, we've left sufficient time. Please use the GoToWebinar question facility. No point in sending us emails. We're here online with you. So use the questionnaire facility, and I will feed those questions into the conversation amongst our four distinguished panelists. And so in the interest of time, I'd like to begin with somebody coming in actually from a mile from the Pentagon, which I think means we're really close to the seat of power here in Virginia. Anthony Cordesman, the floor is yours, Anthony.
Thank you very much. And if I could have the first slide. I think one problem for a lot of people is looking at press articles. They tend to refer to who Biden was and to past administrations like the Obama administration. But the Biden administration, even in its first few months, has to face the future and not the past. And it has to do it where the Republicans will probably control the Senate, which in our system means they can block appointments, they can block legislation, and they can block changes to the budget. It will inherit the COVID-19 budget crisis, where we have not funded any of the next steps necessary to deal with this second surge. And we already have encountered a new $3.3 trillion deficit in the budget. That's a massive amount to have to deal with. We haven't passed the FY 2021 budget request, and that year began in October. And yet the new administration has about 6 weeks to reshape the entire federal budget for FY 2022 after it comes into office. It can stretch it out to 6, but that's difficult. It is not going to focus, as we have in the past, on fights against extremism. But it's unclear from the debates going on in the administration, the new administration team, and in the Pentagon and the National Security Council, how much we'll focus on global issues versus the main threat from China and Russia. One thing is very clear. American military strategy and national security strategy is being reshaped. There have been major efforts going on by each of our commands to examine new options, new force structures, and new approaches to competition. And that's covered every region in the world in specialized command. And it's very specific. It's not just words, it's programs, plans, and budgets. The administration will come in with divisions over how to deal with China and Russia, competition versus confrontation. Some of the most important changes, and the ones that will affect our relations with Britain and with all of our allies, are a shift to a new approach to warfare called joint all-domain operations. This might have actually surfaced in some detail, but President Trump fired the Secretary of Defense leading the effort after the election and left the vice chief who'd been running it in a sort of waiting mode. What it really means is a new focus on everything from gray area operations and low intensity or non-combat competition to the highest levels of war, a totally different level of integration of weapons, command and control, sensors, and intelligence. Each of the services and commands is debating this. We have the words, a lot of them are appearing in our NATO allies and to some extent in Britain. But the final point I would raise about this is for all of the people coming in to the national security community, the State Department, into the Department of Defense, this is also going to be as political and economic as military. The extent to which Trump rejected a common approach to the economics and political side and focused on burden sharing is one thing that virtually all of the people nominated have very clearly rejected. How they're going to balance it out, what the president's going to decide, given all of these problems and constraints, I think in all honesty, none of us can clearly predict that as yet, including the president. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to be very quick. Her Majesty's government is very clear in defining what Global Britain means. It's on their website. It's about delivering international ambition, using government assets, maintaining global standing, reinvesting in relationships, championing the rules-based international order. Global Britain is a UK that is open, outward-looking, and confident. That's what we're telling everybody. The reality may well be quite different. We're going to use the aid budget and our diplomatic network, which is going to be world leading to show the world what Global Britain can achieve. We're going to be confident. Ministers have lined up confidently to tell us that 0.7% of international aid and development is the law, and as a country, we obey the law. Despite 5 former prime ministers stressing that to do so would be a strategic mistake, a risk destroying our international reputation and be morally wrong, the government decided to cut aid, but it's only temporary, whatever that means. Our global standing was already damaged by the Supreme Court's ruling on prorogation, which showed that the UK government had acted in a manner that was unlawful in trying to close down parliamentary oversight and supervision of the executive. That's quite a hit to our international reputation and to our international ambition. We've been told the Internal Markets Bill will break the law, although it's only going to be in specific and limited ways. Again, damaging to our reputation and our capacity to function in a global world. We are going to be unable to criticise others because they will rightly tell us they're only acting in a specific and limited ways, and anyway, it's only going to be temporary. The question is going to be, what validity will our opinion have, and how do we expect others to trust us in our press towards global Britain? The UK is going to tell us that it's open. One of the things that it's going to be open to is charges of hypocrisy, money laundering, buying into political parties and institutions. Now, I'm not saying that other nations don't have the same problems. The problem we face is that corruption is running deep and it's not being challenged. Peter Ricketts, one of our former diplomats, has said Britain will be less useful to the new US administration, and that Biden will be looking more at Paris and Berlin. The rules-based international order, the Prime Minister here is actually Viktor Orban, but it could actually be a UK that has a test and trace moonshot world-beating democracy that has failed to tackle COVID. Again, the new President of the United States is going to return to governance, alliances and values. And what is Britain going to be delivering? This suggests that actually what we're going to be judging would be judged as not what we can do, but how useful we've been. We need to remember how people see us, not what we want to tell people that we are. Thank you.
Madeleine, that may have been brief, but it was intense. Thank you. And I'm actually in admiration. I was afraid you might try and do that in Scots, but I certainly couldn't do it with my accent. Anyway, if we could now turn to Catarina, the floor is yours. Looking forward to it.
I think it's Carl first.
My apologies, Carl. Slides were slipping there.
All right, well, everyone, hello. Sitting, as we all have been, in our bedrooms and living rooms, staring at the world through our computers over the last year, I think we've all kind of reached a kind of dim awakening that without leaving our homes, we have all been brought to some strange new kind of front line. It might be kind of news of kind of botnets over there, or fake news networks over there, or tech giant CEOs being dragged in front of increasingly shrill political committees. It might be the infodemic the WHO was warning about earlier this year. It hasn't been a year really that's been characterized, I think, more than any other by a kind of conflict in information, by information warfare. It's an idea, I think, that has really shaped this year. And it's an idea that we all need to understand. The big difference to begin between information warfare and what's happened before is how central information really is to all of this. So information has always been used in war. We can go back for millennia. Fake letters causing castle gates to be thrown open, deceptions being used in Normandy landings. But the big difference, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, was there was this kind of crucial conceptual flip. First, I think, made by militaries, then by extremists shortly after, then by political campaigns. And that conceptual flip really changed information from being a tool of war to being a space that war happens within, to being a domain of war. So you have air, sea, land, space, cyber, and then information. And people have even added cognitive as being another theatre war after that. And so this kind of entire vocabulary began to break out, where people started talking about informational dominance, informational weaponry, mimetic weaponry, information maneuver. They began to deploy basically this entire, to extend the war metaphor here, phalanx of phraseologies, typically used in warfare to information. A strange grab bag of lots of different things, really, partly manipulating platforms, partly manipulating attentions, partly trying to control the way that people understood major events. And no events more important this year, of course, than the US elections and COVID. also the two most informationally conflicted events, I think, in the history of humanity. This has absolutely enormous consequences for all of us, I think. Firstly, information in a theatre of war really has only two values. It has no inherent value unto itself. It becomes something which becomes instrumentalized to really being achieving either behavioral or attitudinal outcomes. So information is something which causes you to either change your beliefs, maintain your beliefs, or change or act in a certain way. That's why it is useful. And in the US case, especially, we've seen all the different flowerings of information warfare all in a central point. So we've seen it as part of a domestic political campaign. We've seen it as part of geopolitical competition. We've seen how easy it is for even disaffected individuals to do, and we've certainly seen how this is the way in which extremist political groups all the way across the political spectrum are seeing their main route to having influence and gaining power. In terms of where we go next, if this US election, like many others, becomes a trailblazer, then I think we can expect information warfare to do several things in the months and years ahead. Firstly, this is going to become the creature of corporates very, very quickly. It's going to both become a service that companies offer, and it's going to be something which hit companies, their brands, reputations, market positions, and everything else. Secondly, this is just going to become a central part of how political campaigns are really fought. I think it's going to be seen to be pretty embarrassing for political campaigns if they don't do information warfare in the years ahead. But I think this is just going to spread. It's going to spread down to local, small elections for dog catcher. And for sure, this is going to be hitting societies with far less strong traditions than the United States, far less free presses than the United States, and far less protections the United States had, far, far more as well. So one of the big questions then is what states, liberal democracies actually do to respond to that. It was a big question 5 years ago. It remains a big question today. Whilst we have so powerful conventional military overmatches in the West against autocratic adversaries, in the informational space, we are doing very, very little really, and can do very little so far. So I think it's, to end, for me, it's really the idea which defines this year. I think it's really now the space which defines a lot of geopolitical and geostrategic competition. And I think it's also the space where we have the most worrying and patent disadvantages.
Carl, great. Thank you. Catarina.
Hi, so I want to talk a little bit about the public opinion piece in this puzzle. So the specific question I was tasked to answer is what influences public opinion? And of course, the long answer is many, many things. But one thing that can help, especially in this environment in which, especially in terms of policy or security policy preferences where people might not be terribly informed, one of the things that can guide forming opinion about specific policies can be our general foreign policy attitudes. There are three main foreign policy attitudes: isolationism, multilateralism, and unilateralism. There's been a lot of talk in the media in the past years saying that people who voted to leave the European Union have an isolationist stance. I find absolutely no evidence of this. Less than 30% of people in the UK, you can measure isolationist attitudes in different ways. It's always less than 30%. In many ways, we can debate until the cows come home if whether the referendum should have been carried out in the way it was, right? And if people understood, and that's all very well. But at one level, it was a really basic question. Do you want the UK to continue to operate through multilateral institutions such as the European Union, or do you want the UK to operate more unilaterally? And that's basically what we find, right? People who voted to leave the European Union, again, very low on isolationism, just as everyone else, but they're higher in terms of unilateral attitudes, right? They want the UK the idea of global Britain should resonate with everyone in the country, right? People who voted to leave the European Union, they're higher on this isolationist kinds of stance, which is also why they're more likely to support increased defense spending. They're more likely to support nuclear policies or any kind of militaristic attitudes. They want the UK to be able to go at it alone. Whereas on the other hand, unsurprisingly, as it should be, right, people who wanted to remain in the European Union are going to be more in favor of multilateral options. That's exactly what the European Union is, right? So again, and we find a 20% point difference between multilateralist attitudes of those who voted to remain in the EU and those who voted to leave. So I think this is very important when we talk about this context of global Britain, right? One of the main things we need to decide now as a country is what our national orientation is going to be, right? People talk a lot. I don't know what they mean by this. They talk about grand strategies. I don't know what that means, and I don't know what's so grand about it, right? But Mike Clark from RUSI coined this term of national orientation, which I think is really, really clear, right? One of the main decisions we're going to have to make right now is, are we going to orient ourselves towards the US? Are we going to orient ourselves towards Europe? And this idea of global Britain. So first, I'm sorry, I have a little bit of data I want to share. When people are asked if the UK should continue to have an active part in the role, security experts, almost all of them, 97% of them say yes, the UK should have an active role in the world, right? Again, that's unsurprising. These are security experts. That's what they do for a living. 67% of members of the public also think the UK should continue to have an active role in the world, including 62% of Leave voters. Very similar item, right? I asked members of the public in terms of economic globalization in particular, if it's been mostly positive or mostly negative for the for the UK. Again, unsurprisingly, 93% of security elites think that economic globalization has been mostly good, right? This was one of the things in the whole referendum debate. These elites think this is beneficial. This hasn't been beneficial for the public. Nonsense. 76% of the public, 3 out of 4 people in the UK think that economic globalization has been mostly good for the UK, right? There's a difference between those who voted Remain and those who voted to leave. 87% of those who voted to Remain think economic globalization has been mostly positive, but so do 72% of those who voted to leave. Another thing that I think is important to distinguish here, right? When we talk about the EU and these different, we're going to find out really soon if we have a deal or we don't have a deal, right? And the economic implications of that. But something else, if there's anything you take from what I'm saying, I hope it's this. The public is very good at distinguishing between economic integration with the European Union and security and defense integration, right? Again, across the board, there is a wide appetite of people in the UK, whatever they voted for in the referendum, to maintain close security alliances with the European Union. 94% of experts think that we should continue to share our intelligence as we leave the EU, as does 85% of the public. Let me just say that louder again for everyone in the back. 85% of people in the UK think we should continue to share our intelligence with the EU even after we've left. This includes 82% of those who voted to leave. Again, there is no appetite to reduce our intelligence sharing. When it comes to our security alliances with Europe, 79% of the public think our security alliances with Europe should remain strong. A little bit lower than what the security experts in the UK think, right? It's 92 for them. It's unsurprising, right? And among those who voted to leave the European Union, 67% of those who voted to leave think we should continue to have strong security alliances with Europe. And in general, the importance of security alliances with Europe are even higher than security alliances with the United States. I see that Michael is making kind of signals. I think time has come. But one thing I want to say that's very, very important here when we talk about public opinion is that a lot of research I have conducted shows that security experts, which probably includes every single one of us on this call, are remarkably bad at understanding public opinion. I've done work where I've asked public opinion to estimate the views of security experts on different policies, and the inverse, right? Ask members of security experts to estimate the views of the public. Both groups are wrong. Everyone is wrong. But security experts are a bit more wrong, right? So when we talk, there are gaps, and undoubtedly there are gaps between what security experts think and what members of the public think. But those gaps, just like those old mirrors we used to have in those old cars, right? Objects are closer than they appear.
Catarina, let's hear from some of those people from the public then, shall we? Our first theme was splinterization. So there are a lot of recent trends that point to a desire to separate technology streams, for the controversy here over Huawei, to separate supply chains, zones of influence. Catarina, you pointed out isolationism, multilateralism, or unilateralism. The term splinternet seems to express this online. Recent Chinese moves to support the UN's International Telecommunications Union's push on standards for COVID-19 apps, rather than using traditional internet bodies, might be another sign of a splinternet. We've got 5G, we've got low-level satellite constellations. So the question really is, in which environment is global Britain best placed to thrive, connecting a splintered world or in an open and connected world? Now, our audience has already foreseen this. Bob McDowell asks, splendid isolation was a term to describe the diplomatic practice of avoiding permanent alliances. Are we entering a global era of splendid isolation? And I think the first question really is for you on this one, Anthony. Sam Grundy asks, do you think the initial announcements for Biden's cabinet represents an ambition to return to the status quo before the Trump administration and a return to a more internationally focused USA, more multilateral?
I think the first answer is it definitely is a return to a more international and multilateral approach. I think one has to be very careful about saying that that means we're going back to where we were before the Trump administration. You use the term splinterization. Well, understand that virtually every aspect of national security today involves systems totally decoupled from the internet in every way, and information involves things like electronic orders of battle, imagery, a whole host of activities which almost operate to a different language and culture. And one of the things is the cost. When you talk about integration, you have to understand that at this point in time, you have two countries in the world that can actually afford the full structure necessary to provide this level of command and control, intelligence, and battle management. One is China and one is the United States. Russia can't. I think one problem that I have with a lot of the European discussion is Europe collectively spends about 3 times the amount of money that Russia does on defense. It is not a country with a strong, growing economy. The problem is where people spend it. When you talk about Britain or any other power trying to compete in this world, and you talk about splinterization, we almost have to work together. The United States cannot afford to do it alone, and to be blunt, as we saw from 1991 onwards, there is no European power that can operate at the edge of modern military technology by itself. It either has the support of things like U.S. space, communications, and battle management assets, or it can't perform a wide range of missions.
Madeleine, I've got a question here for you from Douglas Andrews. Can a Britain, which stands outside of all major trading blocs but remains within the US-EU security establishments, still be considered to be a global Britain?
As I said at the end of my slides, it's not so much about how we see ourselves and what we want to project as to how actually people are seeing us. And the whole exercise has been damaged by the fact that we tend to forget in the UK that the rest of the world is also speaking English. And I've sat on coaches with members of NATO countries where they've been reading our newspapers, they've been tuning in to our debates in Parliament, and have been quite shocked and horrified at the language that was used and the anti-European language. So we're trying to do two things at once. We're trying to say, yes, we're part of this network, we're part of the alliance, we're with you, we want to share with you, we want to be trusted partners. But at the same time, we're saying to people who see the EU and NATO as one entity that we want to split from half of their joint entity. And I think we have underestimated the damage that we've done, perhaps not in the eyes of the British public, but certainly in the eyes of many of the political forces in Europe.
Carl, we've got an interesting point here from Christopher Samuel that I'd like you to address if you wouldn't mind. Security experts do not think that it is important to keep the public informed. The UK is the worst at this, with little access to security information. What is the fear of freeing the armed forces to address and be addressed by the public? So, your thoughts?
Well, I think certainly the fear around the armed forces engaging in information, whether that's explaining what they're doing to the public or explaining what they're doing to the public with information, is a long historical one. I mean, we always in liberal democracies, we've built very strong safeguards, both legal and normative, against having our militaries mucking around too much with a free press or what citizens read or feel or think, for very good reasons. And that's why they are so uncomfortable, I think, trying to maneuver in this space. There's the kind of key limiting factor here to fighting information warfare is not technical. Like, undermining social media platforms at a very grand scale for an organization that operates at the scale of a military is totally trivial. I mean, Russia today, RT's budget annually, and it's a very effective international covert kind of PSYOPs kind of installation for Russia, is about 2.5 tanks and a couple of planes. Like, this is just not expensive for militaries to do. And for sure, I mean, liberal democratic militaries could do it too, but the limiting factor for them is legal. It's not, it's not technical. So if we've got a choice really, which we're going to have to make politically, it's not going to be down to militaries to make this themselves. Either A, we have to draft like rules for engagement in the information space. We have to create a permissive environment which really clearly defines what militaries can and can't do. Or B, we've got to de-escalate. We've got to do peacekeeping. We've got to use the multilateral apparatuses that we've got, including NATO, actually, Madeleine, absolutely. I think NATO, frankly, should be drafting kind of informational defense pacts right about now, to try and see how we can use asymmetric responses to what autocracies are doing in information.
Thank you, Carl. Catarina, you ended on the point that security experts get it wrong. Bob McDowell points out recent elections seem to indicate that the media fails to gauge accurately public opinion. Is this actually part of the problem?
It can be, particularly when it comes to issues like foreign policy, right? Members of the public, in a rational way, everyone has a busy life. They're going to be less, it's going to be less interesting to them to actually spend time out of these busy lives to learn more about foreign policy. So when it comes to foreign and security policy, they end up holding the short end of the stick, right? Especially at the beginning of conflicts. We know that as conflicts continue, as issues continue, it's more likely people will become more informed, particularly when there's some kind of division amongst the experts, right? That's kind of the fire alarm model. So when there's some kind of division and these signals are being carried out, presented to the public by the media, right? So the media plays a really important role here, right? If the media doesn't decide to show members of the public, hey, actually, elites there's some kind of fragmentation here, people are less likely to become interested in those topics. So yes, definitely there's a big role of the media, at least as how we traditionally understand it. We're still learning more about the effects of social media outside of these echo chambers that they can produce.
Okay. Well, we wanted to talk about another theme too, and there are loads of questions flowing in. The Obama administration has been often in hindsight criticized for being soft or naive on China when it was in power 5 years ago and longer. What position might a Biden administration take? And in this triad of the US, China, and Europe, what role should a global Britain play? Interconnector, aligned with one bloc, in between two blocs, independent? I'd like to turn, if I could, therefore, to some of the questions we got here. Anthony, one for you. China holds about 1.1 trillion 4 to 5% of U.S. treasuries. Should this be seen as an unacceptable level of financial instability risk for the U.S. government?
I think the answer is no. Ultimately, the problem for China is if it attempts to exploit it, it does China as much damage as it does the United States. Whether China will continue to do it is another issue. But I think the real money issue has nothing to do with this. When you look at the net assessments of Chinese defense spending, you see massive increases. A country that's spending at least 3 times as much as Russia is on the military, probably more. These investments are coupled to civil investments in things like revolutionizing their technological base, what we sometimes call STEM. These are the expenditures you need to look for. And if you pick any one thing out of the matrix of what China's spending, you tend to get it wrong.
Good. Madeleine, question for you, and Anthony, you might just want to kick in with a short comment too. Basically, we've read in the media the threat the internal market bill poses to the Good Friday Agreement. How do you see this affecting the UK and the new Biden administration?
Personally, I think Britain has been caught on the wrong foot. There'd been an assumption by the government that there was going to be another Trump administration. All of the effort from the government side when visiting the US was to link with Republicans, to link with the White House under Trump, and to totally ignore the Democrats. So this current government at the last minute has caught itself very much in an isolated place, and actually very much on the wrong side of the law.
Sorry, Anthony, please.
The one comment I would make is, remember, most Americans don't understand this issue as yet, but one hell of a lot of Americans are Irish. And if you want to have a smooth relationship with the U.S., this had better work out for both sides.
Al Brown asked a question which I'll direct towards you, Carl. To what extent has the US and UK exceptionalism blinded us to the threats and challenges of both COVID recently and information psyops security moving forward? And another comment related to this from Tangi Morgan. How does COVID-19, which is borderless and not military, play into this discussion about information sharing?
Well, gosh, I mean, I know so little about exceptionalism, apart from it seems to be a very, very universal thing that countries all seem to have, which I've always found a very strange thing. I willfully misinterpret this question, if I might, Michael, to make one other point, because I'm not sure how many other opportunities I'm going to get. Now, one of the things that we all need to think about is how geopolitical competition is taking new different forums and new stages. And I'm especially worried about forms it's taking which we're actually paying no attention to, and they seem so arcane and weird and, to be honest, boring, that they're kind of going under the radar. One of the most important scenes of conflict that countries are currently locked in is around the standards and protocols which govern the way that the internet and technologies work. This has typically been this little walled-off community of engineers and a few specialist diplomats that have kind of handled it amongst themselves. That's one of the most important parts of the Splinternet. So the West, America, the UK, we want this kind of internet which remains basically open, which remains basically free for anyone to join and doesn't make much of a decision around what information flows where. China and Russia have began to make very, very deliberate attempts to basically recode the internet. And especially when it comes to Internet of Things, a whole new layer of protocols need to be added on. And there's protocols which are being kind of mooted and even got UN approval by China and Russia, amongst others, that basically would turn the internet into a giant library with a single librarian. And that single librarian basically says who can open what books. It's called digital object architecture, this particular protocol. Some people should look it up. The problem here is that we can argue about the law, we can argue about international apparatuses, and we can argue about morals, but a huge amount of power is flowing through protocol. That really bakes in more than anything else what the reality of technology really looks like just on a constant basis. And it's just so arcane and boring and weird that no one really understands it or pays any attention to it. So there's this huge, glaring, awful mismatch between how influential these new strange spheres are and really how many security professionals and journalists and other people actually spend any time covering them.
Yeah, so and I'm conscious that you're doing some interesting research on the dark web, which is very, very important in that regard. We've got a comment here from Jack Devereux, which I'll direct towards you, Catarina. He says it strikes him that there seems to be an absence of serious analysis and research of what others expect of the UK. So he points out NATO, the EU, the Commonwealth, as well as what our adversaries think. Is there truth in this, or that this is another example of British exceptionalism, or are we missing that type of research and it's really being conducted?
There is some research that's being conducted right now, and there is some people who have been looking at that more generally. I think part of the research that I think is interesting now is not necessarily how these institutions look at the UK, but also how they relate to each other, right? So, is NATO the only game in town, or is it, as Macron and Merkel have been signaling from time to time, because of what Trump has occurred in the States, and of course he has lost the election now. But does that effect go away, right? Is it time for Europe to have independent defense options also? And how does that include the UK is something I think we also need to think about. But yes, I agree. And going back to what Madeleine was saying earlier, that I think it's also important for people in the UK to think more about how public perceptions of the UK, and I think that is an area that is under-researched.
Okay. Madeleine, Angel Gaviero's got a question for you, and he apologizes, but he does find the phrase global Britain a bit vague. What does it really mean? And perhaps you could help by comparing what we mean today, perhaps with what it meant in the Thatcher era. What is actually different?
Well, as I said, according to the government, what it means is that we're delivering international ambition, using government assets, maintaining global standing, reinvesting in relationships. I mean, these are fuzzy, comfortable words, but what the heck does it mean? At the bottom line, it's got to mean we're looking for new trade partners. We want to work with you. Let us sell you our goods and we'll buy yours. Our problem is, who is in the marketplace? We get alienated the European Union. We're going to be outside of any sort of deal with the US for some time. China is looking at us askance because of our decision over Huawei. What you have to ask is, in this launch of global Britain as a new trading partner, who is out there that is going to replace the great wealth that was coming to us from being a member of the European Union? There's a lovely quote that said that even if we had successful trading agreements with every country in Africa, it would not come to the same value of our current trade with Germany alone. And that's our problem. Global Britain is a marketing ploy that's about a new economy, but one that I doubt is going to be successful in the world that has shifted.
Wouldn't mind if you just point out that Keith Oliver says, having heard Michael Gove this morning on the importance of the UK as an independent sovereign state, what does Madeleine think of the failure to compromise on the emotive issue of fishing with the EU? It's another example there.
Well, Michael, you will understand my frustration that fisheries, which brings into the British economy less than lawnmower sales, is taking precedence over things like our manufacturing base automotive, the City of London, insurance. We seem to have a government that is fixated on fisheries as if it was somehow a marker of our independence and our global outreach, whereas in fact, most of our fishing fleets are tiny, and the licenses that we had were sold off to European fisheries. So I can't get to grasp with at all why on earth the government is focusing on fisheries. It is nonsense, because apart from anything else, we need the French to market and take those goods to market for us, because we don't have the capacity.
Anthony, there's a desire here to look a little bit at the Pacific. Paul Mandesy and Anita Miller have got some points here. The discussion has focused so far on the US, UK, EU. What is your view from the outside on should the UK be engaging with the global economic center of gravity that's going to be firmly located in the Indo-Pacific? And in particular on trade, we've got the CPTPP. Do you think that the UK should be joining this? And also, do you think that Biden might be reopening those negotiations?
Well, I certainly hope that Biden will, and I think that it certainly would be useful from a global viewpoint to have Britain as active in these economic structures as possible. And that isn't simply the organization you mentioned, but when you talk about a global role, we have to remember there are countries like Australia and New Zealand where there are natural ties for Britain. But we've all of this conversation to date has addressed globalism in terms of economics. And I thought Madeleine raised the key issue. Economics are competitive. They're not a matter of policy. You only win and you're only global if you can compete. The same is true in military terms. I think, frankly, most of us, when we hear about European defense initiatives, and this includes many people I knew from working in NATO, think of this as a joke. Really? You haven't been able to cooperate with each other in actually buying real military capabilities almost throughout the history of the alliance. You've almost had to be bludgeoned into becoming interoperable by your own militaries. Show me what you can actually buy. And I think when we talk about Britain's global role, one real question is, I've seen the press reports of the new increases in British defense spending. Exactly what are you going to buy, and where can it be global when you're dealing with powers like Russia and China, and they're halfway around the world and you don't have bases? Ultimately, it isn't just a matter of policy, it's where is the money going and what does it buy? And I think one of the things I find mildly infuriating about even decisions among experts in my area is if they don't follow the money, they're not an expert.
Yeah.
Carl, we've got a point here from Philip Leone that there's this panic about the UK's global role. Fair enough, but the government's credibility and communications gap is huge domestically. Trust between Her Majesty's government and its citizens is at an all-time low. Militarization of the police forces. We can all handle the usurping of rights by the MOD in foreign lands, but are we bringing a lot of this home? Any thoughts on how to rebuild that trust?
Yeah, I mean, what an excellent question, Philip. I mean, another actor very present in geopolitics now we haven't mentioned are the conspiracy theorists, a kind of a growing and potent force around the world, who are probably the most important kind of subcultural phenomenon that we're currently having to deal with when it comes to the political landscape as it exists today. I think a lot of people, experts, professionals within international relations and kind of security communities have consistently kind of underestimated, like the kind of size and galvanization and mobilization of conspiracy theorists. Not to mention lots of political actors until at least 2016 have underestimated conspiracy theorists. They are absolutely hammering the kind of faith and trust in a lot of public institutions right now. We're about to have an enormous struggle, I think, with vaccination around the world as a result of all of this. I think over the last year, it's got so much worse as people have just been exposed to more and more things happening online. And really, like, what we have now is, and I think what people aren't quite grasping is, you know, people can all see the disinformation and infodemic. They can see the information. What they can't see is the entire social organization that's been built online, which allows that to happen. You know, these are movements which have created senses of belonging and identity and meaning for the people that live within them. Parallel epistemologies, really, and eschatology. So entire ways of getting to the truth. They peer review their own journals. They have their own journalists. They do their own investigations. All of that is kind of undercutting a lot of what's currently happening to all governments, I think. I think this is something that all governments are kind of currently suffering with. All large organizations in one way or another are having to deal with what to do about all of this. And it's one where, whether you're a government or whether you're a police service, you are spectacularly ill-equipped to do anything about conspiracy theorists and theories. Really, I mean, it's really something that I don't have an answer to. But anything that a government seems to do directly only burnishes and aggrandizes the exact conspiracies that you want to deflate. So it's a very, very difficult question, and there's very few levers, I think, available for governments to do much about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, point of information. I'm conscious, though, that the State Department has actually issued some tenders on how to do anti-vaxxing, which is and automated systems to help in that regard. But
yeah, Michael, they're awful, and the State Department has had an anti-conspiracy theory website for years. That the only thing I can see that has done is like be ultimately counterproductive, because all the conspiracy theorists absolutely love it whenever they're mentioned on it.
Well, they would have one of those, wouldn't they? Exactly. Just one for you, Catarina. Then we're going to have to move slowly towards a close, I'm afraid. I'm getting a lot of PhD dissertation suggestions in here, so I'm going to throw this one to you. I don't know how you'll do this, but please try and be brief. Gavin Thomas, in terms of stability, sustainability, and projecting power and innovation, are we at a crossroads between the effectiveness of democratic societies to reshape themselves versus those of more totalitarian governments?
It's hard to play checkers when your opponent is playing chess. And the strategic motivations that are going to influence the options that democratic and autocratic leaders have are different, right? We don't need to think that democratic leaders are lovely people and autocrats are just evil. You know, that's not how it works, right? If you're a democratic leader, you're going to be incentivized to create good public policy because you need that support to stay in office. And if you're an autocratic leader, there's smaller groups of society whose support you need. So yes. They can play a longer term game. If I may, I just want to piggyback on something that Carl was saying earlier that I think is really, really important. We, as political scientists, as social scientists, as people who are interested in politics, we need to get a lot better really, really quickly at understanding how we present information. There's been a lot of research in terms of anti-vaxxers before COVID, and just giving them information about how safe vaccines are isn't just not going to change their views. It's going to make them feel their previous views more strongly, right? And we've seen this. We saw this in the EU referendum. People went out on the Remain camp to spit out data about how beneficial migration was, and look at all these numbers. And while everyone here probably loves graphs and charts of numbers, that's not the way to get at people. We need to understand not just how we present data, but how people, including security experts, as I said, we get things wrong a lot. How we process data also, and we need to do that really, really quickly.
Okay. Keith Robertson is asking about as strategic military power progressively retreats from having soldiers willing to go over the top, it's really being isolated to a handful of countries, the USA and China. In other words, can the UK really be a world leader in strategic military contributions? But what I'd like to do is direct another comment from Gavin to you, Anthony, for your closing remark. What is the incentive for the US to project again internationally rather than simply stand alone? And as an example from Simon Webb, what's likely to happen in the U.S. position with Congress on Iran and North Korean nuclear weapons?
Well, that's about an hour in terms of an answer, but let me say at this point in time, and here I would defer to Catarina, but there's not a lot of U.S. political opposition to staying in NATO. It's just the reverse. There's not a call for a broad retreat from the Middle East. There is an objection to Afghanistan and to the way the war in Iraq was held. There has not been a call for a reduction in the U.S. posture in Asia. And in all of those cases, with the exception of troop reductions actually in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, we actually have slightly more people in the Middle East right now, if you take those two countries out, than we had 3 years ago. So these are not areas where, aside from our current president's rather strange relations with Germany, we face a major challenge. I think the real issue is, are we going to find ways to do it more efficiently? Can we find ways where, as we have in other countries, we rely more on local forces? Do strategic partnerships extend from our traditional allies to better working relationships with governments all over the world? And here, let me just make a point we haven't addressed. That is, for all the problems each of our countries faces over the coming 2 years of coping with COVID-19, just think for a moment how many low-income countries are going to be in a desperate crisis and face massive new sources of instability that didn't have those problems a year ago. These are things that bother me because there's this constant assumption that the world doesn't change and well-meaning solutions don't need to change with the world.
And as we come up, Madeleine, a question to you, actually a very early one from Paul O'Neill. What is the biggest threat to global Britain?
Actually, I'd like to talk about leadership. There is a huge gap in leadership and trust. Now, one of my slides said that the US was looking more to Berlin and France. NATO, and I saw this firsthand in the Parliamentary Assembly, it used to be British and American voices that were very powerful there and that people would listen to, and they'd want to know what our position was. The damage that the Trump presidency did was that nobody thought that America really cared, no matter the fact that Nancy Pelosi brought numerous numbers of congressmen and women across to actually reiterate the American support for NATO. Britain became dysfunctional in terms of its attitude towards Europe, which, as I've said, in NATO is seen, EU and NATO are almost coterminous now. Our problem is going to be who is going to take the leadership that reassert the public trust and a belief that what governments are saying is what they're actually going to deliver at a time when climate change is going to make the virus look like it was a blip. Australia is already having very serious wildfires. The one thing that we should be using the virus and our response to the virus to do is to actually look at what leadership, global leadership, not just a global Britain, but a global leadership, can actually do to fight the real issues that we are facing as a world, with lack of water, increased fires, increased insect infestation, and the future that we're just on the edge of not even recognizing is coming towards us.
Well, I'm afraid, folks, we've come to the end of our hour, and a very full hour it has been too. I'd clearly like to thank all of the people out there who sent in questions and comments. The panelists will be receiving all of them, and if they wish to respond to you directly, they can. I would like to thank you for participating and look forward to it, but most importantly, I'd like to thank our partners, Cityforum, and their sponsor, BAE Systems. It's really a delight to be able to be involved in these sessions. But most of all, I think I have to thank our panelists. You've been superb today at really covering an enormous amount of ground and devoting your time and attention to this audience's cares and concerns. Unfortunately, I'm unable to open up the floodgates of applause, so I have here my Korean karmic clapper, and I will deliver that from a temple in Bulgoksa somewhere as a way of just saying thank you. We really appreciate you participating here today, and hope to see many of you again. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.